Date: August 7, 1942. Location: the skies over Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Altitude: 18,000 feet. The air was thick with the silent promise of violence. Sunlight flashed on polished aluminum as a flight of 8 Japanese A6M-0 fighters, the undisputed masters of Pacific air combat, sliced through the tropical blue. Below them, a quartet of American F-4F Wildcats, heavy, boxy, and comparatively slow, lumbered into position. This was the opening salvo of the most brutal campaign of the Pacific War, and to the experienced Japanese pilots, these American machines were nothing more than flying coffins, easily dispatched. Sub-Lieutenant Tanimizu, a veteran of the Long March across Asia, settled his sights on a Wildcat's tail. His plane, the famous Zero, was an engineering marvel, fast, agile, and armed with 2 deadly 20mm Type 99 cannons. The 20mm shell was a tiny bomb packed with a high explosive charge. It was the doctrine of Imperial Japan: 1 or 2 hits from this cannon and the enemy plane would disintegrate. Quality over quantity. The decisive blow. Tanimizu pressed the firing stud. The Zero shuddered, the 20mm cannon sending out 2 slow, distinctive puffs of dark smoke, followed by the tracers. A brilliant white flash erupted near the American engine, a clean, undeniable hit. In theory, the fight was over, but the Wildcat did not disintegrate. It shuddered, dropped a wing, and then impossibly recovered. And then the Wildcat returned fire. It was not the heavy, measured thump of a cannon. It was a terrifying, continuous roar, a metallic, screaming frenzy that lasted for a full, unholy second. It was the sound of 6 M2 Browning .50 caliber, heavy machine guns firing, a deluge of lead traveling at 2,900 feet per second. This was the great industrial irony of the Pacific War. While the European air forces embraced the devastating power of the 20mm cannon, the United States pinned its faith on the heavy machine gun, the venerable air-cooled AN-M2 variant of the .50 caliber. To the sophisticated aviation minds of Japan and Germany, this was an archaic choice, a bullet against a bomb. The Americans were outgunned on paper. But the Wildcat pilot, oblivious to the theoretical arguments of ordnance experts, was applying the American doctrine, the doctrine of volume and reliability. The 6 guns of the Wildcat delivered a combined rate of fire exceeding 4,500 rounds per minute. In a typical short-range dogfight burst of just 1 second, the American plane could launch a fusillade of 75 rounds, compared to the Japanese Zero's combined total of perhaps 20-30 rounds from its 2 20mm cannons and 2 smaller 7mm rifle caliber guns. The core of the conflict was in the cartridge itself. The Japanese 20mm shell, while devastating, was notoriously complex, suffering from low muzzle velocity and persistent jamming in high G maneuvers. The ammunition drums were small, often limiting the cannon to just 60 rounds per gun. The pilot was armed with 4 seconds of firepower. The American .50 caliber, by contrast, was an absolute monument to simplicity and industrial reliability. It was belt-fed, meaning it rarely, if ever, jammed, even under the most extreme stress. Crucially, the ammunition belts of the Wildcat carried a total of over 1,800 rounds, granting the American pilot 30 to 40 seconds of continuous fire. In the heat of battle, 4 seconds versus 30 seconds was not a technical specification. It was the difference between life and a sudden, violent death. As Tanimizu's Zero banked hard, trying to escape the torrent of lead, the heavy .50 caliber rounds, many tipped with M8 API, armor-piercing incendiary, found their mark. They did not explode, but they bored deep, their kinetic energy devastating control cables, puncturing oil lines, and, most terrifyingly, setting fire to the fragile, unprotected fuel tanks of the highly maneuverable but lightly armored Zero. The laughing confidence of the Japanese ace would soon be replaced by a cold, stomach-churning realization. They were not outgunned, they were merely outnumbered by the bullets themselves. This was the moment the balance of power in the Pacific Air War began to shift, not with a roar, but with a horrifying, ceaseless metallic scream. If this technical and cinematic approach meets your standard, consider subscribing to the channel for the rest of this epic 5-part series. The roots of this deadly technological disparity lay not in the drawing rooms of aviation designers, but in the echoing halls of American industry, specifically the workshops of John Moses Browning. His M2 heavy-barrel machine gun, developed in the aftermath of World War I, was a masterpiece of simplicity and robust design, but its air-cooled lightweight cousin, the AN-M2 aircraft version, became the true industrial colossus. While Axis powers chased the promise of the cannon, the Germans with the formidable MG-151-20, the Japanese with their Type 99, the US military command, driven by the ruthless logic of mass production and battlefield logistics, stuck to the high rate of fire machine gun. This choice was initially ridiculed, quote, attributed to a pre-war RAF pilot. The American .50 caliber is a fine instrument for shooting out tires on a landing field, but it will not kill an enemy aircraft. The criticism was not without merit. A single .50 caliber round was less destructive than a 20mm explosive shell. It lacked the immediate, catastrophic knockdown power. But US Air Force strategists like General Hap Arnold understood a fundamental truth. You cannot miss fast enough to win a war. What mattered was not the size of the hole, but the number of holes in the right place. The genius of the American system lay in its integration. The M2 was so reliable that engineers could group them, multiplying the lethality without complicating the mechanism. The classic American fighter of the war, the P-51 Mustang, did not carry just 2 or 4 guns. It carried 6 M2 Brownings, all firing forward, synchronized for a devastating convergence. Late war bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress turned into flying hedgehogs, mounting anywhere from 10 to 13 of the heavy machine guns in flexible powered turrets. This incredible volume demanded an industrial effort on a scale the Japanese could never match. The ammunition itself, the 12-7x 90mm cartridge, was a logistical triumph. Factories like Lake City Army Ammunition Plant churned out millions of rounds daily. The simple, robust design meant the rounds could be mixed in a deadly cocktail. A typical combat belt featured a mix of API, armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, and ball rounds. The tracer was the pilot's eyes, a streak of fire guiding the aim. The armor-piercing round with its hardened steel core was the cold fist, punching through engine cowlings and light armor plating. The incendiary round was the match, igniting flammable hydraulic fluid, oil, and fuel vapors. Quote from an American armorer, "We didn't just load the guns, we loaded a recipe for fire. A few hits, and you had a barbecue on your hands." Across the vast Pacific, the Imperial Navy's engineers, supremely confident in their doctrine of maneuverability and cannon power, were slow to grasp the threat. They had prioritized the Zero's range and agility, achieving it through extreme weight savings. This meant virtually no armor plating for the pilot or self-sealing fuel tanks. Admiral Ugaki Matome noted in his wartime diary, "The Americans build their planes like tanks, and their bullets are like rocks thrown by a giant. Our pilots are skilled, but skill cannot withstand a storm of fire." Initially, the Japanese pilots laughed at the slow-firing, seemingly clumsy American planes, but the laughter died in the cockpits over Rabaul and Guadalcanal. They were used to the single massive impact of a cannon shell. What the .50 caliber delivered was not an impact, but a systemic trauma. A high-speed sandblasting that severed cables, shattered instruments, blinded the pilot with oil, and, worst of all, lit the unprotected aircraft on fire from multiple internal sources simultaneously. The M2 was not a precision surgical tool, it was an industrial wrecking ball. The American strategy was simply to overwhelm the target with kinetic energy until it ceased to function. And the M2, with its massive logistical tail, was the perfect tool for the job. The initial shock of the .50 caliber forced the Japanese to re-evaluate, but their focus remained on the Zero's core strength, maneuverability. Their pilots, masters of the high G-turning dogfight, were confident they could evade the American fire. However, the .50 caliber was inherently suited to the aggressive American strategy of boom and zoom. The American fighters, the P-38 Lightning, the F-6F Hellcat, and the P-51 Mustang, were heavier and possessed superior diving speed. They would use the advantage of altitude to dive upon the Japanese. fire a quick, devastating burst from their multiple M2 guns, and then use their speed to escape before the nimble Zero could turn to engage. The Hellcat pilot's view. The F-6F was built like a truck, but it could dive like a meteorite. I'd come down on a Zero from 25,000 feet. The moment my 650s opened up, it was like throwing a bucket of scrap metal at them. You didn't need to lead them perfectly. You just needed to cover the area. The sheer density of fire guaranteed hits. We called it hose piping. The effect on the enemy aircraft was terrifyingly rapid. A Japanese engine hit by multiple 50 rounds would seize up immediately. A pilot targeted in the cockpit would be subjected to a stream of armor-piercing bullets that could punch through his seat's light armor plate at oblique angles, a capability the lower-velocity 20mm often lacked. For the Japanese air crews, the perception of the American bullet fundamentally shifted. Early in the war, the Americans were easy kills. Now, the very sight of the heavy, robust American fighters struck a deep, unsettling fear. Quote, attributed to Japanese Zero pilot Saburo Sakai, "The American bullets were everywhere. They came not as a few shells, but as a cloud of steel. They were so numerous, so continuous, that once you were hit, you had no chance. It was like running into a solid wall of iron." This psychological terror was compounded by the devastating effectiveness of the AN-M2 in the defensive role aboard bombers. The B-17's twin-gun waist positions and the B-29's central fire control system coordinated an unprecedented amount of firepower. Japanese fighters, attempting to close for a cannon run, found themselves flying straight into a solid wall of 50 caliber tracers. In 1943, analysis showed that the majority of Japanese aircraft shot down over the key battle areas were victims of the AN-M2 machine gun, not the US Navy's 20mm cannons, which were still prone to cooling and jamming issues. The tactical reality was simple. The high-velocity, high-volume 50 caliber rounds, despite their lack of explosive filler, delivered a far greater probability of a disabling strike against the lightly constructed Japanese airframes than a low-velocity 20mm cannon, which often missed its fleeting target. The story of Guadalcanal, where the Japanese lost the critical battle for air superiority, is fundamentally a story of the Yo-50 Cali. While Japanese pilots were running out of 20mm ammunition after their first few passes, American pilots could hold their fire, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver an unforgiving, sustained burst. It was the strategic advantage of American industry, miniaturized and compressed into a single devastating cartridge. The Japanese had optimized their weapons for the perfect hit. The Americans had optimized theirs for the inevitable hit. And in the brutal, chaotic, high-speed world of a dogfight, inevitably won. The initial island campaigns of 1942 and 1943 had been brutal, tit-for-tat exchanges, but as the war progressed from the Solomons to the Marianas and beyond, the industrial verdict against Japan became absolute and non-negotiable. The strategic shift was made terrifyingly visible in the sheer, unsustainable scale of losses the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Forces, IJNAF, were suffering. This was not a slow bleed. It was an industrial massacre. The Americans didn't just win battles, they literally annihilated entire generations of Japanese pilots. This rapid, irreparable loss of veteran skill was the brutal, unyielding function of the M250 caliber. It became the primary driver of the phenomenon that US pilots grimly dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Date, June 19, 1944. Location, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The engagement was less a battle and more a colossal failure of strategy and technology for Japan. In the skies, saturated with US Navy F-6F Hellcats, each armed with 6 devastating Brownings, the Japanese launched their desperate counterstrike. Wave after wave of aircraft flown by new, desperately trained pilots who lacked the irreplaceable experience lost over Guadalcanal. But the Hellcat, built around its simple, powerful 6-gun array, was the perfect interception tool, a flying platform designed for the relentless delivery of lead. The Japanese High Command, still clinging to the doctrine of the lightweight interceptor, had inadvertently given the American 50 caliber the ideal target, a fast, fragile airframe with virtually no redundancy or defensive armor. By 1944, the Japanese had finally begun to acknowledge the necessity of heavier firepower. introducing more robust fighters like the Kawanishi N1K1J Shiden, Allied codename George. This excellent, if belated aircraft often carried a 4-gun array, sometimes mounting a mix of two 20mm cannons and two smaller 7mm or 13mm machine guns. However, the deep-seated reliability issue of their high-caliber weapons persisted. The Type 99 cannon remained complex, prone to feed failures and jamming in hard maneuvers, the very moments when a pilot needed guaranteed fire the most. Crucially, the overall volume of fire from these mixed armament platforms remained critically low compared to the US standard. The 6 synchronized M2s of the Hellcat or Mustang delivered a concentrated, highly reliable stream of 3.5 to 4.5 ounces of high-velocity metal per second. The Japanese counterpart simply couldn't compete with that rate of sustained delivery. A crucial factor that cemented the American advantage was the quality of the ammunition itself. By 1944, the US was fielding the M33 armor-piercing incendiary, API, round with devastating consistency. These rounds were not tiny bombs. They were high-speed hardened steel darts designed to punch through the structural integrity of the aircraft. This M33 API was the final nail in the coffin for Japanese attempts at light armor and self-sealing fuel tank development, which had lagged significantly behind the Allied nations. The API rounds not only penetrated the thin aluminum skin, but carried their incendiary charge deep into the engine or cockpit before erupting in flame. In the span of just 2 days during the Turkey shoot, American pilots claimed over 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed, often with single, short bursts. The combat reports frequently emphasized the quick, spectacular kills. This was facilitated by the M2's high muzzle velocity, which imparted a flatter trajectory than the slower, arcing path of the Japanese cannon shells. This made aiming significantly easier at the long distances and high speeds of the interception, effectively turning the Hellcat into a highly effective, long-range sniper. Quote from Hellcat ace David McCampbell, who shot down 9 aircraft in one sortie. "Once you had him in the sights, you just hosed the area. The tracer was perfect. When those API rounds hit a 0, it just quit. No fuss, no drawn-out chase. You saw the puffs, a sheet of flame, and he was gone. It was like the airplane couldn't handle the trauma, the sheer shock of so much high-speed metal hitting all at once. For the surviving Japanese pilots, the M2 was not merely a weapon. It had become an executioner. The sheer hopelessness of the situation permeated their morale. They were facing not only better protected aircraft, but an overwhelming tide of concentrated firepower that rendered their superior pre-war maneuvering doctrine obsolete. This terror led to the abandonment of conventional interception tactics. Many resorted to increasingly desperate measures, including the infamous kamikaze attacks. This was a strategy born not of fanaticism alone, but from the cold, agonizing realization that their conventional weapons and aircraft were simply incapable of penetrating the American defensive wall of 50 caliber fire to strike the vital US fleet. If a bullet couldn't kill a ship, perhaps the entire plane could. It was an act of desperation, tragically confirming the tactical superiority of the American defensive armament. The dominance of the M2 extended to the sea. The machine gun absolutely dominated the naval anti-aircraft role. On US destroyers and battleships, the quad M45 meat chopper mount, 4 M2 Brownings firing simultaneously, created an absolute curtain of steel. While larger 20mm and 40mm cannons were critical for longer-range targets, the 50 cal provided the terrifying close-in defense against dive bombers and torpedo planes, filling the sky with so much lead that collision with a bullet became a statistical certainty for any approaching aircraft. The continuous stream ensured that even a small change in enemy trajectory guaranteed impact. The industrial verdict was thus inescapable. The Japanese had prioritized destructive power per projectile, often sacrificing practicality and reliability. The Americans had prioritized destructive power per second, backed by limitless industrial might. The M2 Browning was the cold, unfeeling embodiment of the American war machine. Durable, simple, mass-produced, and ruthlessly effective. It was the blunt, terrifying instrument that systematically dismantled the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force, bullet by bullet, gun by gun, plane by plane. The era of the lightweight, nimble cannon fighter was over. The final climactic act of the 50 caliber's strategic dominance played out not in the close-quarters spectacle of a dogfight, but in the relentless industrial grind of the strategic bombing campaign high over the Japanese home islands. The B-29 Super Fortress, the ultimate expression of American air power, was a flying fortress in every sense of the word. Its defensive armament was built entirely around the volume principle. It carried a remotely operated, centrally controlled system of up to 12 M2 Brownings. High above the Japanese home islands, facing the few remaining interceptors that could reach their altitude, the B-29s formed tight, impenetrable defensive boxes. Japanese pilots, operating out of dwindling fuel reserves and flying technologically outclassed aircraft, faced a deadly, impossible choice. Closing within effective range of their own 20mm cannons meant flying straight into a controlled, integrated firestorm of high-velocity, 50 caliber rounds. The B-29 gunner's perspective. It wasn't a dogfight, it was a firing range. You'd see the tracers going out, converging exactly where the computer said they should. The fire control system was the brain, but the M2s were the fists. When a Japanese plane hit that stream, the tracers would just disappear into the airframe, and a second later, you'd see the plane start to break up. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, the feeling of absolute, unstoppable power. The very terror of the M2's lethal volume directly influenced the final, most desperate Japanese tactic. It forced them to abandon the last vestiges of conventional interception and rely almost entirely on suicidal ramming or the pre-planned kamikaze dive, an act of last resort that tragically confirmed the tactical, logistical, and technological superiority of the American defensive armament. The M2 had so thoroughly dominated the air that the only remaining way to score a hit was to become the projectile. When the war ended in August 1945, the M2 Browning 50 caliber heavy machine gun had cemented its place in history as arguably the single most important small arm of the conflict. Its technical specifications, its high muzzle velocity, its robust reliability, and its exceptional effective range were the perfect counter to the lightly armored high-speed aircraft and the fragile naval vessels of the Imperial Japanese war machine. The true legacy, however, extends far beyond the number of Japanese planes shot down. The original design by John Moses Browning has achieved a level of longevity unmatched in modern military history. The M2 Browning remains in frontline service today, a design that has withstood every major conflict for over a century, from World War II to Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan. No other weapon of its class can claim such an enduring operational life, a fact that speaks volumes about its perfect blend of simplicity and lethal power. It is a testament to a fundamental truth in warfare. The simple, reliable, and mass-produced instrument, when backed by superior logistics and a sound strategic doctrine, will always overwhelm complexity and high-tech fragility. The Japanese sought the decisive single-hit kill with the cannon, the elegant surgical solution. The Americans, in their industrial might, opted for the guaranteed, overwhelming 1,000-bullet solution, the absolute statistical certainty of destruction. In the end, it was the sheer unrelenting volume of reliable American firepower that choked the air war over the Pacific, turning the once feared A6M0 into a doomed relic. The legacy of the 50 caliber is simple, cold, and true. Quantity has a quality all its own, especially when that quantity is delivered by a torrent of perfect, reliable steel. If this deep dive into the technology and human drama of the Pacific Air War resonated with you, ensure you don't miss our future historical analyses. Hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to join us as we continue to uncover the most important untold stories of World War II.